The day 93-year-old Eleanor Whitmore disappeared from the neighborhood, most people assumed she had finally moved in with family. That was exactly the story HOA Karen wanted everyone to believe. Eleanor had lived in the same house for more than 50 years. She was a quiet widow who spent her mornings tending flowers and her evenings sitting on the porch with a cup of tea. Everyone knew her, everyone respected her, but over the past few months, Karen had become unusually interested in Eleanor's property. The house sat on one of the most valuable lots in the community, and rumors of a future development project had quietly begun circulating among HOA leadership. At first, Karen's visits seemed harmless. She offered help, asked questions, and constantly reminded Eleanor about paperwork and community rules. But some neighbors started noticing something strange. Every conversation seemed to end with Karen bringing up the house, the deed, or Eleanor's ability to manage things on her own. Then, almost overnight, Eleanor was gone. Karen quickly told residents that the elderly widow had been moved to a medical facility because she could no longer care for herself. Most people accepted the explanation until small details stopped adding up. Eleanor's curtains remained open exactly as she had left them. Her flower garden was still being watered by someone. Most suspicious of all, HOA representatives suddenly began discussing the future of the property before any official announcement had been made. When concerned neighbors asked questions, Karen became defensive and insisted everything was being handled legally. But the more she talked, the more uncomfortable people became. Something felt wrong, very wrong across town. Eleanor sat in a private room wondering why nobody had come to see her. She had signed no paperwork agreeing to leave her home. She had never told anyone she wanted to move. Yet every attempt to contact neighbors seemed to hit a wall. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages never reached their destination. What Eleanor didn't know was that someone was working hard to keep her isolated while decisions about her property quietly moved forward behind closed doors. Karen believed the widow was alone, forgotten, and powerless. She believed nobody would question her story. She believed nobody was paying attention. But one evening, a young delivery driver arrived at Eleanor's house with a package that had been delayed for weeks. Finding the home apparently abandoned, he mentioned it during a conversation at a local diner. What seemed like an ordinary comment immediately caught the attention of someone who knew Eleanor far too well to believe she would leave without saying goodbye. Within days, old friends began comparing notes. Questions turned into concerns. Concerns turned into an investigation. And as pieces of the puzzle started falling into place, Karen had no idea that the carefully constructed story she had spent months building was beginning to crack. The truth was still hidden, but not for much longer. The questions started spreading faster than Karen expected. At first, she dismissed them as neighborhood gossip, but every answer she gave seemed to create even more suspicion. Eleanor's closest friends knew something was wrong, because the woman they had known for decades would never leave without telling anyone. She never missed birthdays, church gatherings, or weekly calls with old friends. Yet suddenly, she had vanished without a word. The more people thought about it, the less Karen's explanation made sense. Soon, a small group of residents began digging deeper, collecting information, comparing timelines, and searching for anyone who had recently spoken with Eleanor. What they discovered was alarming. Several neighbors recalled seeing Karen visit Eleanor repeatedly during the weeks before her disappearance. Others remembered conversations where Karen questioned whether Eleanor could still manage her affairs. One resident even found HOA meeting notes discussing future possibilities for the widow's property before she had supposedly decided to leave. That discovery changed everything. The issue was no longer a missing neighbor. It had become a question of whether someone had been trying to influence what happened to her home. Meanwhile, Eleanor remained isolated and confused. Every day she asked when she could return home. Every day she received vague answers. Staff members believed they were following proper procedures and had no reason to suspect anything unusual. But one employee became concerned after noticing how consistently Eleanor described wanting to go back to her house. She seemed clear, coherent, and fully aware of her circumstances. The employee quietly documented those observations, unaware they would later become extremely important. Back in the neighborhood, pressure continued building. Friends contacted distant relatives. Old records were reviewed. Phone logs were examined. Then came the breakthrough. A family member living in another state finally learned what had happened and immediately traveled to investigate. Within days, they met with Eleanor personally and were shocked by what they found. The elderly widow clearly understood who she was, where she lived, and why she wanted to return home. The image being presented of someone completely unable to make decisions simply did not match reality. That discovery triggered a chain reaction. Independent evaluations were requested, legal documents were reviewed, property records were examined in detail. As professionals began asking questions, Karen suddenly became far less willing to discuss the situation publicly. The confidence she once displayed started disappearing. Meetings became uncomfortable. Residents noticed she avoided direct questions about Eleanor and the property. Then, another bombshell surfaced. Documents connected to discussions about future development showed that Eleanor's property occupied one of the most strategically valuable locations in the entire neighborhood. Anyone hoping to expand projects in the area would greatly benefit from controlling that lot. For the first time, people began seeing a possible motive behind everything that had happened. As investigations continued, inconsistencies started appearing everywhere. Statements conflicted with timelines. Records failed to match explanations. Decisions that once seemed routine suddenly appeared highly questionable when viewed together. The carefully controlled narrative that Karen had relied on for months was beginning to collapse. Community meetings became packed with angry residents demanding transparency. Many homeowners who had never attended an HOA meeting before showed up specifically to ask about Eleanor. They wanted answers. They wanted accountability. Most importantly, they wanted to know why a 93-year-old widow had been separated from her home while discussions about her property quietly moved forward. The turning point came when independent reviewers completed their assessments. Their conclusions painted a very different picture from the one Karen had promoted. Eleanor was found capable of understanding her circumstances and expressing her wishes. That finding immediately changed the conversation. Suddenly, people were no longer asking whether Eleanor should remain away from her home. They were asking why she had been kept away in the first place. Within weeks, arrangements were made for Eleanor to return. The day she came back to the neighborhood was unforgettable. Residents lined the street waiting to welcome her home. Some carried flowers. Others brought food and gifts. Many simply wanted to see her smile again. As her car slowly entered the neighborhood, people applauded. Several neighbors wiped away tears. For months, they had feared they might never see her again. Eleanor stepped out of the vehicle and looked at the house she had lived in for more than half a century. For several moments, she simply stood there, taking it all in. Then she smiled. The crowd erupted into cheers. For Karen, however, the situation had become impossible to ignore. Questions continued coming. Reviews continued expanding. Support that once protected her position rapidly disappeared. Residents who had trusted her leadership now openly challenged her decisions. Board members began distancing themselves from the controversy. Some resigned. Others refused to defend what had happened. In the months that followed, major changes swept through the HOA. Policies were rewritten. Oversight increased. Residents demanded greater transparency. The community had learned a painful lesson about what can happen when too much authority goes unchecked. As for Eleanor, she spent her days exactly where she wanted to be. Back in her home. Back in her garden. Back among neighbors who cared about her. Looking back, many people agreed on one thing. Karen believed Eleanor was isolated. She believed nobody would notice. She believed nobody would fight back. She was wrong because while Eleanor may have been 93 years old, she was never truly alone. And in the end, the people who cared about her proved that a community standing together can be stronger than any plan built on secrecy. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. We upload new stories every day, and your support helps the channel grow. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next story.